Hello everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's session in the theme of anthropology in the world. I'd like to start off by apologising very profusely for not being physically in London this afternoon. Unfortunately, some unexpected events, a bit of a crisis, conspired against me, so I've had to stay in New York. And I know that it's not the same to give a speech on video as opposed to being in a room. I'm sorry I won't be able to discuss with you, but I'm extremely honoured and very flattered to be asked to give this talk. And it's something I feel very strongly about, because much of my own career has been dedicated to trying to take anthropology out into the world and trying to bring some of my world experiences to bear on my anthropological training. It's something I feel very passionately about, and I'd like to commend very strongly the RAI for actually organising this session and talk a little bit about why I think it's so important, some of the lessons that I've learned and some of the big challenges and opportunities that I see going forward from my own perspective. Very much hope that this will spur a wider debate, and I'm very willing and keen and in fact eager to take part in a wider debate in the future. And if there's an opportunity in the future to discuss with people in England, in London, these themes, I would be absolutely thrilled and honoured to take part in that and bend over backwards to do so. Well, I'd like to start by talking a bit about my own personal background and how it is that I've come to be trying to use my anthropology within the wider world, and also a bit about why I'm using my anthropology not within the traditional academic confines. I started life as an anthropologist at Cambridge University. I did a BA there, and after my BA I fell into a PhD, as much by accident as design, I must say, and went to a place called Tajikistan, Soviet Tajikistan, or then Soviet Tajikistan, down on the Afghan border in Central Asia. Like many anthropologists, I picked my fieldwork site partly through accident as much as any design. I'd previously worked in Pakistan, so I spoke some Urdu, which is quite linked to Tajik, and I'd also worked in Western China, but the Western China avenues were blocked after Tiananmen Square. So I arrived in Tajikistan, and my main area of fieldwork and study was looking at marriage rituals and trying to use the marriage rituals and the study of marriage rituals as a vehicle for exploring the relationship between the communist identity and Islamic identity in the Soviet Tajik space. My supervisor was Professor Ernest Gellner from Cambridge University, whose own research, of course, had looked closely at these issues of Islam and communism. But along the way, I received extremely valuable help and guidance from people like Caroline Humphrey at Cambridge University, Alec McFarlane and Keith Hart, all of whom I'm profoundly grateful for and made a great impact on me in terms of developing my own ideas. So I started off as a pretty classic anthropology PhD student, and after doing my anthropology, or rather in the course of doing my fieldwork in anthropology, I began to get quite interested in journalism. In many ways, it's quite obvious that journalism and anthropology are quite similar disciplines, in the sense that what both disciplines do is tell people about other people. Anthropology does that at quite a slow pace, in some ways in quite a purist way, and for a smaller pool of people. Journalism does its job of telling people about other people much faster, in some ways with more shortcuts, at least more intellectual compromises, but of course for a much wider range of people. And perhaps it was natural. I started doing some freelance articles when I was an anthropologist and doing my fieldwork, and began to explore the ideas of getting into journalism. Then I came back, interned a bit at the FT, the Soviet Union broke up, and one thing led to another, and next thing I knew was I was off in the former Soviet Union and spent a year of my life basically freelancing for the FT and becoming or breaking into journalism. And then after that I went back to Cambridge and tried to finish my PhD. Like many people in the audience, it took several attempts, but I did finally finish my PhD, and then I was basically faced with something of a crossroads, because I knew that at that point I could either try and go down the path of academic anthropology, or I could go down the path of trying to be a proper journalist. And to be perfectly honest, I was quite torn in some ways because I love anthropology, I love the discipline. And yet at the same time, I also found back then, this was in the early 1990s, some aspects of academic anthropology quite frustrating. Anthropology struck me as a discipline that had so much to offer the world, and I'll come on to why that was in a minute, and yet was often quite inward-looking, oddly inward-looking. It sometimes felt quite detached from the real world and real policy-making decisions. Of course, at the time, anthropology was also pretty short of jobs. I was very clear-sighted that it was going to be hard for me to actually find a job in academic anthropology. And I must say that journalism did seem to be pretty exciting by comparison. It gave a chance to explore the world, to go out and tell people about other people, amid big intellectual compromises, but also amid a real sense of dynamism, excitement, and a feeling that maybe, just maybe, one could help to not just understand the world, but maybe contribute to the way it was developing too. So I went off and joined the FT. Very conscious of my anthropology background, but initially at least, I spent quite a lot of time doing anything other than talk about anthropology. The reason was that I joined the FT, and partly by another series of accidents, and so much of life is unplanned and is about accidents, but I ended up on the economics department of the FT. And initially, I regarded that as being almost tantamount to purgatory, because the kind of reporting I'd done when I was an anthropologist was very much looking at social trends and political trends and kind of cultural issues that appear to dovetail quite naturally with the cultural studies that I'd been looking at as an anthropologist. And I, like many anthropologists, looked at the discipline of economics and finance and markets and banks with tremendous suspicion, if not dislike. The whole idea of looking at the money world seemed to me to be a bit dirty, and economists struck me as having often a very poor grasp of how the world worked, precisely because they tended to ignore so many of the cultural issues that I as an anthropologist had studied. But I ended up on the economics team, and in fact I ended up on the foreign exchange column. And within about 2 weeks of doing the job, and thinking initially I was just going to do it as my kind of penance, if you like, and for getting trained up as a journalist and then go off and do something more interesting. But within 2 weeks of doing the job, I suddenly stumbled on a really road to Damascus experience, in that I was sitting there trying to understand how a particular corner of the foreign exchange market worked. And I suddenly stopped and thought, well, hang on a sec. If I went to Tajikistan and learnt Tajik and unpicked Tajik marriage rituals and tried to understand how the Tajik cultural ecosystem worked, I can jolly well learn how foreign exchange markets work too. And what's more, I began to realize that if I could master the language of economics and the language of banking and the language of foreign exchange, and actually understand the rituals that made the rhythms of the market operate, and the identities and the cognitive framework that dominated the participants in foreign exchange markets, then not only would I going to have access to another really fascinating ecosystem and a chance to explore the other, as it were, in much the same way that I'd been trying to explore the other in Tajikistan, but also I would actually begin to have an entirely different vision on how the world worked. Because the fact is that unless you understand how money goes around the world, it's very hard to understand the power structures in the world. Money is power, to be Marxist about it. The means of production really, really matter. And I could see back then that there was a fascinating opportunity in that if one could bring the world of culture and society and politics to bear on finance and economics, and if one could actually get embedded in the world of economics and understand it, and then marry that with the world of culture and finance, you'd actually have the tools for creating a really powerful understanding of how the world operated as a whole. Partly because, certainly back in the early 1990s, there were very, very few anthropologists who were looking at the world of high finance and economics, and there were almost no bankers who were looking at the world of anthropology. So I could see a great opportunity. But at the same time, as I started building my career at the FT, I could also see quite a big challenge. Because the reality was that back then in the mid-1990s and then the late 1990s, and even more so in the first 6-7 years of the noughties of the last decade, the fact was that people who worked in the world of finance and economics really didn't have much time at all for soft disciplines or soft social sciences like social anthropology. If you think back to the way that the financial markets operated, back to the kind of mindset that shaped many economists and policymakers, if you think about the way that many of the governments were run, and to a certain extent the business media and the big mainstream media operated, there was a very strong presumption in the 1990s and the first 7 years of this century that the things that really mattered were economics, numbers, money, computing, equations, things like that. Certainly if you were writing about finance and economics, there was a feeling that actually having a PhD in astrophysics was what you wanted, not a PhD in social anthropology, because it was all about computer models. It was quite macho. And I remember very clearly going to see a senior banker in 2006, by which time I'd left the foreign exchange column, gone to work in Japan, gone to work in America, come back to London, worked on the Lex column, and then joined the capital markets team. And I went to see a senior banker and was talking about my background and said, I have a PhD. And he said, oh, in economics? And I went, no, social anthropology. And he went, oh, well, that's all rather hippie, isn't it? Back in the days when being a hippie wasn't really a good thing. So certainly, as far as the world of economics was concerned, having a PhD in social anthropology was seen as a bit odd. And slightly to my own subsequent shame, I tended to be rather quiet about it, and I very rarely advertised the fact that I had this background in anthropology. I was always very keenly aware that actually having my training in anthropology helped me a lot in journalism, and I'll come on to how and why it helped me in a minute. But at the same time, I was also aware that I was something of a covert anthropologist, an undercover anthropologist, if you like, in the sense that I wasn't exactly blazoning a trail or talking about it very much. But really starting in about 2005, 6, 7, that began to change. And it changed really for two reasons. Firstly, around that time, as many of you know, in 2007, a financial crisis erupted initially in America and then across the Western financial markets, which really upended not just many of the assumptions about finance and economics, but also, it's subsequently clear, many of the ideas that people were using to actually look at finance and economics. Very broadly speaking, I think that 2007 was the year when bankers and policymakers and investors began to realize that actually trying to look at finance purely through the prism of mathematics was a terrible mistake. The idea that you could reduce everything to a computer model or equation simply didn't hold true. I used to say to people, well, there is a reason why the word credit, as in credit markets, comes from the Latin word credere, meaning to believe or to trust in some interpretations. And that's because actually at the end of the day, credit markets, financial markets, are not just about computers. Credit is fundamentally a social construct. It's all about whether you believe and trust people around you, central banks, banks themselves, and the value of money. It really is about the way that human beings perceive the world around them, their cognitive framework, the kind of social structure they have around them. And when times are good, in the credit boom before 2007, it was very easy for everyone to ignore that and forget that. But when times are bad and panic hits the financial system, what happens is people suddenly realize that very basic truth, which is that credit markets without credit, in the most basic Latin sense, the social sense, simply don't work. Finance without faith is worth absolutely nothing, no matter how good your computer models are. And so, in a sense, what happened in 2007 was that the world's policy-making and investing community had a very, very brutal reminder that actually finance is fundamentally about human beings, about cultural patterns, about social structures. And the way that banks organise themselves inside banks is incredibly important. The social rhythms and dynamics inside banks really, really matter. I mean, anthropologists like Karen Ho and Caitlin Zaloom have done some brilliant work looking at these internal dynamics inside trading hubs, trading platforms and banks. And it's very, very important, even though people have often ignored it. But also the way that finance is perceived across society as a whole, the way that bankers interact with the rest of the society and the governments, again, is something that's rooted in culture. And when banking has spun out of control and the oversight of the rest of society, the consequences can be very, very damaging. So the social context of finance suddenly became incredibly important in 2007 and then in 2008 and 9 as the financial crisis hit the large investment banks. And then another leg of this wake-up call occurred, if you like, which is it's really starting in 2009 and 2010, the Western world began to tip into something of a sovereign debt crisis. And I'm sure you're all following the events in the Eurozone very closely. But it's become clear once again that when economists and policymakers and investors talk about the fundamental questions like, will the Eurozone hang together? What is going to happen to the Eurozone economies? Will governments like Ireland or Greece or Portugal or Spain actually ever repay their bonds? What people are talking about, once again, is not just numbers, but they're also talking about social constructs, social trends, and all the kinds of things that anthropologists have looked at for a very, very long time. And that might seem very obvious to anthropologists, but it's worth emphasising that although economists and policymakers have been looking at what they call political risk in context of so-called emerging market countries, i.e. non-Western countries, countries outside the US and Europe, although they've been looking at these social and political factors for a long time in a place like Argentina or Brazil or Indonesia, for most of the last few decades before 2007, when investors and economists looked at places like the US and the Eurozone, they tended to once again just focus on the numbers. They were looking at GDP and inflation and debt ratios, things like that. There was a feeling that actually questions like social cohesion, civic values, levels of popular trust, and cognitive frameworks didn't really matter that much in terms of assessing the issues like debt ratios and the future of bond markets. But once again, just as people in 2007 woke up and realized that finance is fundamentally about social issues, so too people in 2011 and 12 have woken up and realized in a very powerful way that these soft social factors matter enormously. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that actually, as I went through my own career as capital markets editor and then financial editor, and now in America as US managing editor, where I effectively run the American operation for the FT, I have begun to realize actually I no longer need to be a covert anthropologist. On the contrary, I've become fantastically proud of my anthropological training because it's something which is very much in tune with the times, and I would argue in many ways right now there is a terrific opportunity for anthropologists in any walk of life to stand up, hold their heads high and say that we have something very, very valuable to offer. In many ways it's the biggest opportunity that I think anthropology has seen, if not in its entire history, then certainly for several decades. So that's one reason why I've moved from being a covert anthropologist into being a very, very proud anthropologist. The second reason, though, is that in tandem with this wider change in the world, the way that finance and economics is perceived, I've also become acutely conscious in the last 5, 6, 7 years of just how incredibly valuable my own training in anthropology is. And I want to explain a bit about that because I think that anthropologists themselves don't always realize the value of what they have. And the value of what they have lies not simply in the ability to do ethnography and to collect information, which is often the way that it's perceived by the outside world. I mean, people ranging from the CIA in America through to Silicon Valley tech companies, through to advertising companies, they all think they want anthropologists because they want somebody who's very good at gathering information and data, which on one level anthropology is. But anthropology is not just about ethnography, as you all know. It's also about a filter and a way of looking at the world. It's about the way of trying to conduct analysis. And I think that once again, what's happened in the financial crisis shows very, very clearly quite why this filter matters and why we should all collectively not just be very proud of it, but do our best to try and insert it in the wider public debate. Now, if I had to put my finger on what I think defines this filter that kind of gets implanted into each of our brains as we go through an anthropological training, I would say that there are probably at least 3 key factors. Not just 3, but 3 that have been very important to me. And these are in no particular order. Firstly, anthropology tends to teach its adherents how to look at power structures. Very obvious point, but much of what anthropologists are doing is looking at power structures and how they're actually replicated through time. Secondly, I think anthropology looks at not just how power structures are replicated through the economics means of production, i.e. who has more money or not, and how they hang on to that money over time, which is partly in a way economics sometimes. But anthropology also spends a lot of time looking at the discourse, at the cognitive map, at the intellectual framework, at the symbolic and cultural framework of society, and seeing again how that reinforces power structures over time. I mean, this is kind of very basic stuff. It's Anthropology 101. I feel almost embarrassed telling a group of anthropologists this because you all know this much better than me. But it's worth stressing that point that anthropologists tend to look not just at what is said in public, the discourse, and how that promotes a power structure over time and reproduces it, but they also look at what's not said, the social silences, if you like, in a society, and how that reinforces the wider power structure. I, like perhaps many of you, was very heavily influenced in my own intellectual development, not just by the works of Ernest Gellner, my supervisor, but also particularly by Pierre Bourdieu. And the idea of Pierre Bourdieu of, dogma and doxa, heterodoxy, orthodoxy and things is very familiar and very important. It very much informs my interest in social silences. But lastly, and leading out of that, anthropology also makes a point of taking a joined-up view of the world, and does so very much from a bottom-up perspective, not a top-down one. And I think one of the great defining filters or features of anthropology, or having an anthropological filter, is the ability to take a joined-up view and to try to put things in context. And I'll stress that, putting things into context and trying to see how all the parts of a society hang together is something which is very, very valuable and very powerful. Now, anthropologists do this and do it almost instinctively. And I think that after several years of being immersed in anthropology, I kind of didn't even notice what was so special and valuable about this filter. Or I didn't notice until I actually moved into other areas like economics and like finance, and began to realize that actually what anthropologists have is fantastically unique in some ways and incredibly important and valuable precisely because other parts of society don't have that. And in particular, in my experience, in many ways, a discipline like banking or economics is almost like the anti-anthropology of the modern world. If you spend time in a modern investment bank or an economics department of a university, you basically, in some ways, don't look very much at, or don't look explicitly at power structures. You don't spend much time trying to deconstruct the dominant rhetoric or ideology, and particularly you don't if that dominant rhetoric and ideology is something like the discipline of economics or modern finance. And you don't, for the most part, spend time trying to look at how all the pieces of an ecosystem add up together. On the contrary, in many ways, bankers have spent the last few decades being trained to operate with a certain sense of tunnel vision. Bankers typically spend their careers in one department, one specialist area, where they might rise up through that specialist area, but they tend to basically operate with this tremendous siloized mentality, whereby they simply don't have time or interest or inclination to actually try to look at how all the different pieces of a system add up. They're very, very bad at joining up the dots. And it was a key reason why the credit crisis happened, was because in the case of something like subprime mortgage loans, people were scurrying around doing their stuff and not joining up the dots. But in the same way, many of the economics disciplines that I talked about earlier, which are so numerate based or have been so quantitative in the way they've looked at the world in the last few decades, again, they tend to operate often within academic departments or within universities or governments or policy-making foundations. They tend to operate also in quite a siloized mentality. They tend to look at the world through one particular prism and be very bad at actually joining up the dots and trying to add the pieces together. Above all else, I'd argue that both banking and finance and economics tends to be incredibly bad at looking at what I call the social silences, the parts of society that people don't want to discuss. They're very bad at trying to look at the blank spaces on the map, precisely because they tend to focus just on their immediate areas of interest and not look at what's not discussed and how these might be reproducing the power structures over time. Now that all sounds very theoretical, so let me give you a tangible example of how I actually came to realize that this kind of prism was so valuable in my own work and in terms of trying to make sense of finance. And I should say that, this sudden realization was not an immediate, road to Damascus conversion or anything like that. It's really only after the events that I myself became aware of just how valuable this anthropology filter had been in terms of my own writing about finance. But I want to try and explain it because I think it helps to illuminate why anthropology can be so useful. Anyway, so here's my story. As I say, I started off, after Tajikistan. I went back to London, worked as a foreign correspondent, worked as an economics correspondent, went to Japan, went to America, came back to London, had a very international career. And then in 2005, I arrived on the credit team of the Financial Times, the so-called capital markets team, which wrote about high financial areas. And I arrived on that desk, again through a series of accidents, and almost immediately went down to watch a derivatives conference in Nice in France, to try and get a sense of how this new landscape worked and really try and build contacts as a journalist. And that was really in just the beginning of the big credit derivatives boom, which later came to be so incredibly important for the wider financial crisis for reasons both good and bad. And at that time, people didn't really know very much about credit derivatives. So I went down to Nice, where the conference was happening. Banking conferences tend to happen in very nice places like Nice, not Hull. But I went down to the conference, walked into this room full of bankers, and a bit like when I first crashed onto the foreign exchange column back in 1993-94 with the Financial Times, as I walked into that room full of bankers in 2005, I was hit by a very strong feeling of being back in my fieldwork mode. In many ways, it was a bit like going to a Tajik wedding. And banking conferences are often, it seems to me, quite similar to Tajik weddings or any big ritual weddings in terms of their functions. Essentially what they do is pull together large groups of people, a scattered network, if you like, into one place. You have a series of rituals, both formal rituals and informal, that bind people together once again, reaffirm social networks and ties, and perhaps most importantly, recreate the cognitive map that they all share, recreate the founding myths and the sense of identity. And also, by virtue of recreating that cognitive map, you also reinforce the social silences, because the things that are not discussed when that group gets together are, going back to Bourdieu, as important as the things that are discussed. So in my case, I went to Nice, crashed into my CDO conference, and was immediately struck by the fact that I was dealing with a group of bankers, a network of bankers, who were On the one hand, very much a scattered group. I mean, they'd come from all over the world to collect together in Nice. But even though they were a scattered group physically, they were actually very, very similar mentally, because they had a very strong shared cognitive map and a very strong creation myth which bound them together, which was essentially about the idea that they were all taking part in this great credit derivatives revolution, this financial revolution, which they told themselves at the time was going to be very beneficial, very good. There was a whole highly developed set of ideology and rhetoric around this financial revolution, which essentially convinced themselves and provided a very convenient framework for thinking that finance was going to be much better as a result of the revolution. Of course, it also had the function of making these bankers much richer too, and precisely because nobody else understood what was going on, and there was a real sense of elitism and a shared identity and a shared language that no one else understood, what was going on was also reinforcing their own position within the hierarchy. But there was a very strong sense, a very strong idea wrapped up in this whole financial revolution, if you like, that justified what they were doing. And so, as so often in the kind of society that anthropologists study, you had a very rich interface between rituals and a social network and a power structure and a cognitive map and a set of both spoken assumptions and, more importantly, unspoken assumptions that pulled that group together and defined it. And what struck me very forcibly, even back in 2005 and 2006, was that as these bankers came together to talk about their financial revolution, there was an awful lot they were not talking about. So I sat there in the CDO conference, and almost nobody discussed the fact that what these bankers were doing in the room had tremendous impact for the entire financial system. I mean, in some ways, what was going on was as radical a change in finance as what had happened in the internet revolution. And yet almost nobody else outside that group understood it. And the bankers in Nice did not expect anybody else outside that group to understand it. There was a sense of elitism and exclusivity that they took for granted, but which struck me as very dangerous, but they were entirely unable to see, because, going back to my anthropology point, they were not trained to look at power structures, question ideologies, or join up the dots. Again, as I sat there and listened to their founding mythology about how credit derivatives was supposed to work, I could see, I mean, dimly at first and later much clearly, but I could see that there were some very big intellectual contradictions in terms of what they were saying. I won't go into that in detail, but just by way of example, one of the great founding myths about credit derivatives was that the bankers were creating the perfect free market in credit where anything could be traded and everything could be priced according to free market principles. That was a great theory. In practice, when you look back at what was going on in 2005 and 2006, many of the products they were creating were so unbelievably complicated that they were impossible to trade. And so actually, far from having a free market in these new credit products, you had an entirely fictional market where products were being priced on the basis of computer models, not free market prices, because these products were too complicated to trade. So there were no market prices. So absolutely fundamental intellectual contradiction, which almost nobody could see back then because everyone had, drunk the Kool-Aid. They believed their own ideology. Not because they were bad people, let me stress. I mean, it's very convenient to blame the bankers on being greedy or evil. I don't think they were. They wanted to make money, but I think they actually believed their own founding mythology. And as anthropologists know, that is not unusual. Almost every society in the world has some kind of cognitive map in place and shared cultural rituals and symbolic landscape, which reinforces the position of the elites. I mean, once again, this is Anthropology 101. And that cognitive map is often riddled with contradictions, which go largely unrecognized, largely because, as Bourdieu says, there are big social silences. It's what people don't discuss that's important in finance, as in a Tajik village, as what they do discuss. So, in a funny kind of way, my Anthropology 101 was absolutely critical in helping me to try to understand not just what was happening inside finance in 2005 and 2006, but also I would say in spotting some of the dangers, and above all else spotting some of the limitations about the way that bankers and financiers were looking on the world. You know, I often joke in retrospect that if only the banks had had a few anthropologists sitting there in their senior echelons, they might not have been quite so dumb. Not because anthropologists are necessarily any better at finance, but because at least anthropologists are less likely to drink the Kool-Aid than many other financiers were, or that many other participants were. Anthropologists are trained to analyse, they're trained to look at power structures, they're trained to look at the ideology and the rhetoric and the social silences, and they're trained to see how all the bits join up. And by doing that, they can actually shed some very, very valuable light on where societies are going wrong and where perhaps they could go a bit better. So, as I say, it's not just about the ethnography, it's also about the filter and the way that anthropologists are actually trained to look in the world. And that's what makes it so valuable. So in many ways, this leaves me partly on my own experience, partly looking around at what other anthropologists are doing today. It leaves me very, very strongly convinced that there's a huge opportunity and a huge need for social anthropologists to get out and engage with the wider world. It's not just good for many other areas of public policy making, it's also, I think, very good for anthropology too, because there is a danger that social anthropology and anthropologists, left to their own devices, can become almost theoretical, can become quite inward looking, and can become almost a victim of their own tribalism, if you like. So then you have to ask the question, well, okay, if there's this great opportunity now for anthropologists to get out and actually engage with the world and actually get their voice heard, why doesn't it happen more? And therein lies perhaps one of the biggest rubs and challenges of all, which is that in some ways the very virtues of anthropology, which makes anthropology such a powerful discipline, which is the ability to listen, to blend into the background, to be humble about the limits of one's own knowledge, to be wary about being too dogmatic, and the ability to basically be relativist and non-judgmental, are also in some ways the very reasons why anthropology and anthropologists often suffer to get their voices heard. I mean, I remember joking with some of my friends in the Cambridge Anthropology department all those years ago and saying, well, you know, anthropologists are basically happiest probably either being a fly on the wall or hiding in the bushes watching others. They don't usually want to be at the centre of the arena themselves, precisely because anthropologists know that if you are too busy talking and promoting yourself and trying to insert yourself into the arena of debate or public policy making, you are also at risk of losing the very thing that makes anthropology so fantastically valuable, which is the ability to watch quietly, to blend in and absorb information. And in addition to that, of course, anthropologists tend to, by nature of the kind of people we are, to be quite anti-establishment. We tend to be quite cynical of governments, quite cynical of authority, quite cynical of any of the former power structures of society, precisely because we have this filter in our brain which is deconstructing the rhetoric, looking at power structures and joining up the dots, and can see just how artificial many of the constructs in the societies around us really are. And we're probably as cynical about all the artificial natures of the Western society's constructs as we are anywhere else. So it's very, very tough for anthropology as a discipline to actually get itself inserted in the public debate. And again, I've been very forcefully reminded of that by virtue of having been around the economics discipline for a number of years, and you couldn't do a better compare and contrast. I mean, economists in some ways, economics departments are almost like the anti-anthropologists. I mean, they are brilliantly good economists at inserting themselves into the public discipline, into the public debate, very good at finding ways to get access to resources, very good at pronouncing on issues and being very judgmental without self-doubt. I mean, the idea of actually sitting there and saying, well, I'm not really quite sure, or perhaps I need to listen more, or perhaps I need to learn more, or I may not be entirely right, that is not something that economists are trained to think or do. I remember a couple of years ago I took part in an EPIC conference over in Chicago, and a survey was put up on the board asking anthropologists about their pay and whether they thought they were fairly paid or not. And an astonishingly high number of anthropologists in that survey responded that yes, they thought they were fairly paid for their value and their worth. And I was talking to an economist who was there, actually, one of the few economists who's tried to straddle the world of economics and anthropology equally, who just joked to me and said, well, if you'd given that survey to economists and said, do you think you're fairly paid? Almost none of them would have said yes, because economists are taught to maximize their value and to basically grab resources and project themselves. Anthropologists, for the most part, are not, which is of course precisely what makes anthropology such a powerful, wonderful discipline, but at the same time also is one of its biggest Achilles heels. Now, I say all that because in some ways, I am, as I say, a covert anthropologist. And, in my own journey, I have had to learn a whole new set of skills. I mean, I've gone from being an anthropologist who sat for a year and a half in a Tajik village into being a journalist that was trained to basically listen and write stories, and really started to make big intellectual compromises as a journalist, because the reality is that if you work in the media world, you never ever have any great monopoly on truth. You do your best to try and tell stories about the world as you see it, but you have to make big compromises, very big compromises, and sometimes painful compromises. But at least in the early days of my career as a journalist, I was more in listening mode than projecting mode. In my case, as I've risen up through the various bits of the FT hierarchy, I've had to make, in some ways, more and more decisions and learn more and more skills, which take me away from my original anthropology roots. Because the reality is that if you are, as I often am now, going to be in the public arena and project yourself, if you're going to play the media game and not just being part of the media, but being in the media, do television, try and write columns, try and engage, try and get a voice, once again, that involves very, very big compromises. Certainly in America, I know that some anthropologists, and I've taken part in big anthropology conferences here in America, some anthropologists would say that, some of the compromises I've made would not be particularly anthropological in their eyes. I've had people say, well, you don't really have a right to call yourself an anthropologist anymore because you've just gone too far from it, you're not an academic, you're using and abusing some of the terms of anthropology, and I can understand that and respect that. And the reality is that working in the media business does involve huge compromises. In some ways, I'm very bifurcated, almost schizophrenic in the way that I operate, because with half of my brain today, I can analyze the media and I can see big flaws and challenges and shortcomings in the media. The other half of my brain, I actually am trying to run a newsroom here in America and do the very best we can to tell the story and provide information in a way that's credible, honest and illuminating. And yet we are also a product of our own environment and our own resource constraint, and I would be the first person to admit that it's tough. I kind of want to both do journalism and study journalism, both be part of information flows and analyze information flows. And it involves big compromises. That just is the reality. And yet I personally feel very strongly that, in a strange kind of way, although I never planned it, my own journey has given me great opportunities to both pull together my wonderful training in anthropology, for which I'm profoundly grateful for so many people in the Cambridge Anthropology Department, some of whom may be sitting there today, but to pull together that social and cultural background and to try and marry it with an understanding of high finance and banking. And along the way, maybe, just maybe, to try and have a bit of voice in terms of public debate, and maybe, just maybe, to help illuminate the world and to get some people to think, or at least to look at finance in a slightly different perspective. So I've made compromises. I happen to think for me they are the right compromises. But much more broadly, I really hope that sitting in there in the audience today, there are other people who are willing to try and do some of what I've done. Moving out into the public world involves challenges, it's difficult, and I certainly would not hold myself up as the right way to do it. let alone the only way to do it. I know many anthropologists are out there engaged in many other disciplines, many other branches of government, business, other areas. And every single person who's out there trying to find a way to forge their or combine their anthropology filter with other disciplines and other parts of the world is engaged in a pursuit that I think is fantastically important, and I truly applaud from the bottom of my heart. It's tough, but I really think it's very valuable. And I also really strongly think that now more than ever, for all the reasons I've cited, there really is not just a fantastic opportunity, but also a great need. So I want to just finish with pointing to one other example, which is not really about me, because as I say, I just forged one small path. There are thousands of different ways to forge these paths, and probably many are better than me, or rather to forge that bridge. But I was very struck recently that some of you may know that the new head of the World Bank, Dr. Kim, is a medical anthropologist. It's remarkable in many ways and very laudable in many ways. I happen to think medical anthropology is a fantastic discipline because it, perhaps more than any other discipline, shows how it's possible to try and unite different intellectual and academic branches to the benefit of both. I think combining medicine, a science, with an analysis of culture and social trends and all the stuff I've been talking about is fantastically good, both for the world of medicine, which needs much more in the way of cultural analysis, but also for the world of anthropology too, which frankly can often benefit from some hard science, rigorous quantitative analysis, etc., etc. So I think medical anthropology is a fantastically exciting discipline, and I was up in Montreal last year at the American Anthropological Association's annual meeting, and I was electrified to see the sheer range of medical anthropology speeches, students, professors, the sheer body of work being done, which is fantastic, and frankly I would applaud from the rooftops. So the fact that Dr. Kim is a medical anthropologist is brilliant, but what is perhaps even more wonderful is that, as far as I can tell, this is the first time that anybody other than an economist or lawyer or professional politician has actually run a large multinational organization. In the past, the people who've run the World Bank and the IMF have typically been economists, so too the OECD and things. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the new head of the World Bank is going to be good at his job. I mean, opinions on him are, I wouldn't say mixed, but some people are saying, well, maybe he won't have enough political gravitas to do his job, maybe he'll find it difficult. Some people say, well, he was just appointed because he's Asian, etc., etc. Certainly the reports that I've heard suggest he's very good, but we don't know yet. But what is fantastic is that we do have a social anthropologist, a bona fide social anthropologist, up there, engaged with the world, trying to get engaged with policy making, and trying to look at the world through a slightly different set of prisms and spectacles and a filter than traditional. As I say, in many ways it shows that we are at something of a potential turning point. There is huge opportunities. One of the reasons why an economist was not appointed to run the World Bank is because many people now are questioning some of the ways that orthodox economics has been running in recent years. So there's a huge opportunity. There are huge challenges too, but at the same time, it's a very exciting time to be an anthropologist. So in whatever field you're working, whether in academia or in the world, whether you're working in business or government or media or development or anything else, I truly do applaud you. I wish you the very best of luck in trying to forge a path, because these are truly not just exciting times, but potentially important times for us all. So thank you. And once again, I'm extremely sorry I can't be there today to talk to you directly. I very much hope to be part of any dialogue and debate going forward, and I wish you the very best of luck for the rest of the conference. Thank you.